Right, you want to start straight away?
Yeah, let's go for it. I'll let you do intro and then we'll jump in.
Right, guys. So, welcome back to episode 2 of the Warrior Unfiltered podcast. Again, we are joined with myself and co-host Henry. So, today's topic, we are going to delve into expenditure. Obviously, expenditure is kind of like a broad aspect in general, but what we're going to do in this podcast, this episode, is we're going to keep it in the context of just a deficit. We're going to break down the definition of expenditure as a whole in our opinions, and then we'll go into different subunits of what encompasses an expenditure, how we can mediate that, and how we can utilize that in a deficit phase. So I reckon, Henry, if we just start off with the definition of expenditure, do you want to give your
Yeah.
broad definition of
Yeah,
expenditure?
I'll give a definition and an analogy that I use that puts it into a context that everyone would know. Expenditure is basically any way in which you can expend calories. You've got it's so broad. There is so many ways that you can essentially utilize calories throughout the day. The way I look at it, so when you're looking at energy expenditure, I always link it when you're looking at energy balance as a whole, like energy expenditure versus energy input, as like a bank, right? So when you're trying to lose weight, because that's the main thing that most people are looking to do. Obviously, you have gaining phases, but keeping it to this sort of time of year, people are trying to get lean, right? You've got, if you look at it as a bank, you've got expenditure and like money going in, money going out. And we can treat that as calories, right? So if you want to if you want to burn body fat, you need to be taking more out of that bank than you're putting in. And then once you are going below, so like in a bank you're going to overdraft, you need to pay that off. The way you're paying that off is with body fat.
Yeah.
So the way I look at it, expenditure is means of basically getting you into that negative number, negative energy balance that you're going to burn body fat. This isn't just cardio. Everyone thinks the only way that you burn body fat is cardio, and there is so many other ways you can do it. And a lot of ways that you burn calories is just by being alive. Like it's not just you need to go for a run to burn calories. It's a far broader than that, which we're obviously going to delve into throughout this.
Yeah, for sure. I think I totally agree with everything that you said there. It's a good analogy as well with the bank. Yeah, I think if we get more into the scientific definition that I would give, obviously we're looking at, most people probably have heard of this terminology before, but we're looking at TDEE, which is your total daily energy expenditure. Now, again, I think the issue with that, like you mentioned, Henry, is a lot of people just immediately think about, okay, cardio, that's it. TDEE, it can be broken down into different subunits, and those different subunits are, your BMR, which is your basal metabolic rate, essentially the amount of calories you need at rest just for survival. Then you're
Yeah.
looking at NEAT, which is quite prevalent nowadays. I think it's more of a modernized terminology used in bodybuilding. So we're looking at non-exercise activity thermogenesis, and it's basically, the way that I like to explain that is non-structured exercise. So that's just
Yeah.
like daily walking around, chores you're doing in the house, if you're washing the car, walking the dog, going out for steps. Now, obviously, we know a lot about steps. We use that a lot as coaches nowadays. Then we've got physical activity, which is the structured exercise that we're doing, resistance training. Also, you can put within that context cardio. And then you're looking at TEF, which is the thermic effect of food. There is another one as well that's not really used and mentioned, and that's SPA, which is spontaneous physical activity, which is kind of like if you're just talking and then you're just moving your hands. And there was a podcast that I was listening to during my first prep, and they're talking like this like pattern to look out for when you start your prep. Obviously, your energy levels are going to be very high, body fat levels are high. So all this kind of SPA, that's like spontaneous physical activity, is always going to be a lot more greater. But then you'll,
Yeah.
as you get deeper and deeper into that deficit, things like just the movement of my hand as I'm speaking, or just in general, if like on the sofa, like people fidget with their feet or whatnot, that will all decline over time, because that's your body
Yeah.
just conserving as much energy as possible. But I think that one in particular is a bit irrelevant. So if we just focus on your basal metabolic rate, NEAT, physical activity, and TEF. So I think obviously in the context of a deficit, when we're looking at BMR, we are looking essentially at your metabolic rate from the ingestion of food. So as we ingest food, our body, we have a metabolism, it processes that food, the protein, carbs, and fats. Now, obviously, as we go through a dieting phase, there's something known as metabolic adaptability. And obviously that's going to be very, subjective. Everybody's metabolic rate and adaptability is all going to vary. You have some people can still remain on relatively high calories for a long period of time. Other people, they'll have to keep pulling those calories down. Obviously, there are other variables that you can manipulate, but just thinking about calories on its own, some people, they'll adapt very quickly. I've got clients where I can make an adjustment to their caloric intake, and then they can probably see a nice linear rate of loss for like 4 or 5 weeks. Where they're on the other end of the spectrum, I might have a client where we make an adjustment, but then they've metabolically adapted in that week, and then we have to change something again. So it's very person dependent. It's very difficult to say exactly what your metabolism is going to do. And then obviously,
and a good point as well. I think this changes over time for individuals. One prep or diet phase, you can have someone who can change their calories and they'll lose weight for 6 weeks. Then the next time you diet them, just because there's so many variables at play that you won't have the same response, and you can't, as much as you want to use old data when you're doing like repeating phases for someone, in practice it's impossible to create exactly the same environment a year later to do that. Bodies just don't, especially when you've pushed someone up in an off season. It's a completely different environment you're starting from if they're holding more musculature the next time round. It's it's one of those things that you can't just rely on stuff that you've done in the past to work every single time when you come back to it.
Yeah, I've heard before that no two preps will ever be the same. I mean, I've competed 4 times and literally every single prep has been different. Now, obviously, broadly speaking, the like foundational pillars have all been the same, but like there'll be adjustments to calorie intake, like the set point going into my first prep to this prep, cardio, expenditure, that's all been different. So yeah, no 2 preps will ever be the same. But then in terms of collecting that data, it just gives you that kind of like reference point. That kind of correlates with what we were talking about in the first episode with like using studies and literature. It's just giving you a reference point. You can't fixate on what you've done in a previous prep or even like with your athletes. So obviously you've got your client, Aiden, you've done a photo shoot with him, and then now you're in a prep. You can use that photo shoot data, but you cannot use that as gospel. You just have to.
And with that example, this prep versus old one, I went into it with the mindset, right, last prep we started on a lot lower calories. We've got a lot more calories to begin this time. It's going to be a lot easier prep.
Yeah.
I can promise you now, this prep has been 3-4 times harder for him because it's just a completely different environment. He started in a position where digestion was a lot worse. He probably he was a little bit too soft to begin, and he had to suck down a lot harder, even though his calories started a lot higher this time than last time. So that's literally the same individual a year apart, and the way we had to prep him has been so much more harsh when on paper it should have been an easier prep.
Yeah, it's so individualistic. But yeah, also on that note, obviously talking about Aiden, he's 9 days out, isn't he?
8 today. So
8 days. So yeah, big shout. He's looking really, really good. But obviously we'll go back onto this subject, otherwise we'll segue onto other things. But yeah, I think moving on, I think in correlation with BMR, we can talk briefly about refeeds, because when we're looking at BMR, especially in a contest prep setting, we're looking at your metabolic rate being mediated by a hormone known as leptin. So when basically body fat percentage will dictate the regulation of leptin, in layman's terms. And the lower the body fat goes, leptin will increase, and leptin will regulate things like your expenditure and your appetite. So we're also looking at the ghrelin hormone that most people know about. So, people use structured refeeds to offset some of the acute metabolic adaptations. Now, just to bring in one study that I've read, and it's looking at, this study postulating that a 24-hour refeed is not sufficient enough for upregulating that leptin.
Yeah, I've
The
seen
issue
them.
that, yeah, the issue is obviously if you're giving somebody a refeed over one day and I know you bump it up by 200-300 grams of carbohydrates, you will see that acute change in metabolism, but it's transient, meaning it's just short-lived. So, I think when it comes to structured refeeds, as much as there's the utility there for them, they need to be over like consecutive days. I would say at a minimum 2 days, but then again, person dependent, it could be 3 days, 4 days. I just don't see the utility of having a 1 day refeed. You probably will see a shift in things like inflammation the next day, but then 48 hours after, you're just back to where you were, and then you're back to being in that state of stagnation. Body weight's not shifting. I
Yeah.
don't know if you.
And a good example to use on the refeed one, because I've literally just done it myself, is my body weight was pretty stagnant around the 74s. Like, so no, sorry, 74s. I don't know where I got that from. 194s, so 194 pounds.
Right.
I had a 2 day refeed, so I'd done 1800 carb over 2 days. The following morning, I was up to 197. One day after today, I've hit a new low.
Yeah.
So it can be that quick of a turnaround in the utility of it. And I think that's not only the things you've mentioned, it's washing off diet-induced fatigue. I had a better sleep on both of these days because of more carbohydrate intake, better training sessions, less stress because I enjoyed a meal. Like I had sushi with my partner, so that was nice, a nice relaxing. And I think just the combination of all of that puts you in a really good spot. So when you do reintroduce the deficit, that you're going to see a nice flush of information, and then the body weight starts to obviously then will be eaten into fat tissue to follow.
Yeah, 100%. So I think we're both in an agreement that refeeds do have their utility and their merits. But yeah, in my opinion, I think they have to be done over consecutive days. 1 day is just not sufficient, in my opinion. So then moving on, we're looking at NEAT. Do you want to cover NEAT?
Yeah, so NEAT is something that I really like. So NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So the way realistically, the main thing we can track with NEAT is step counts, is getting an athlete to do a certain amount of steps per day. The utility of this, so a lot of people are probably thinking, well, surely it's easier just to do cardio. Like and that's what a lot of the old school mentality is as well, which I'm not saying it's wrong. There's no right or wrong. Everyone gets pilled at the end of the day. But the way I look at it, the benefits of using NEAT as a tool to drive up expenditure over cardio, less fatiguing. So you're not, when you're going out for a walk, you're not pushing to higher heart rates. You're not creating a recovery demand. So it's a nice tool to use that gives you minimal fatigue, and it burns a good amount of calories. So when you're looking at it, so a rough idea, obviously it's not going to be 100% accurate. You're looking at 1 calorie burnt per kilometer per kilogram of body weight. So for me, I know roughly it takes me about 1,200 steps to hit a kilometer. So if you look at it across the day, if you did 12,000 steps, you do 10 kilometers. If you're someone who is 100 kg, I'm trying to work it out now without a calculator. 100 kg, and then 1 gram. Yeah, have a look. So just so we can give an example on that, but I'll have to work it out in a bit. But just, yeah, it's a very useful tool, because then when you want to compare that to an hour of Stairmaster, like what's an hour of Stairmaster going to burn? 400 calories, but how much fatigue and inflammation are you going to get from that? How much is that going to impact sleep? Is it worth doing that when you can use a less fatiguing way to get around it? I'd much rather my athlete do 15,000 steps a day than be doing an hour of direct cardio.
Yeah, I think obviously it's relative as well to the context of it. So, you're not going to get somebody 4 weeks out, like in an ideal world and setting, you're not going to get somebody who's 4 weeks out doing an hour of Stairmaster post leg session. If you
No.
can get them to go out and get their steps done, but then you factor in the cardio on like a rest day or a less demanding training session, like your push or whatever it may be. So you're just literally mediating everything to accompany obviously the setting that you're in. So yeah, I would agree with you. I think the main thing when you're looking at steps is that management of conscious activity. So when you're dieting, because obviously when kind of going in correlation with the spa, when you're starting at the beginning of a prep, your expenditure will be high in general, whether you do track steps or not. And then as you get deeper and deeper into that deficit, you're accumulating a lot more fatigue. You're just feeling very lethargic, very tired, to the point where you're just dragging your feet around. So when you've got that conscious, task of having to go out and get your steps in, it's keeping that expenditure at a constant level
Yeah.
every day. So
Yeah.
then you know that you're keeping that constant, and then what you can do is you can manipulate other variables. So then that will be manipulating caloric intake, steps, if you're assisted using lipolytics, and then just keeping
The
that.
only thing I would say about that, and it's a very small one, it's like it will have some impact, but not huge. If you're going to use a step count, you need to remember as you get leaner, you're burning less calories per step because you are lighter, and you will become the fitter you get, the more efficient your body will be at doing that task. So 10,000 steps at 20 weeks out compared to 5 weeks out is not going to be burning the same amount of calories. So you just need to account for that.
It's the equivalent to on the cardio. If you look at your heart rate at the beginning when you're a lot heavier, you can use an intensity of like 3 or 4 on the Stairmaster, and you'll get your heart rate up into that 130, 140 beats per minute. But you do that same level of intensity when you're 20 pounds lighter, you're not going to be able to get your heart rate up there. So you have to adjust the intensity. So the same comes obviously in the context of doing your steps. That's where the weighted vest would come into it.
Yeah. I'm not a big fan of that.
You're not, no?
Me and Will Dyson, I really do respect his opinion. He's debunked. I'll have to go through it with you, and he's debunked a lot on that, and it's just not worth the use unless you are very small. As in, like if you are a bikini athlete and you're in like the 40 kg range, then a weighted vest. But for us, if we're dropping 20 kilos on a prep, for us to then walk around with a 20 kg weighted vest, the stress that it's going to have on the body is not worth it when we could just do more steps. So I think it's obviously context dependent on the individual. I think if you're a small athlete, and it's going to realistically, you're not going to get a male athlete down at that sort of body weight. So it's a smaller female bikini classes. There's some utility there. But I don't think for someone like yourself, if I told you to put 20 kg on your body and go for a walk, it's going to be a stressful thing to do.
Yeah, so I did actually use the weighted vest in 2020. So I tried to prep during COVID, and it was obviously any means possible to just increase its overall expenditure, because I was very limited with what I had. I only had a stationary bike at the time, and there's only so much intensity that you can put up on that. So it's very difficult to bring my heart rate up. And so I invested in the weighted vest, and I did realize it was just impacting my lower back a lot. I would definitely agree on that front. It's very, very much person dependent. Moving on to physical activity. So we're talking actually resistance training itself. I know, in my opinion, there's this ubiquitous misconception when it comes to workouts and training and using that as a tool to drive up expenditure. Like looking at most of the studies done, it contributes the smallest percentage to your overall daily expenditure. I think one of the studies that I've read, and don't quote me on it, I think they said on average you're looking about 150 to 250 calories burnt from a training session. But again, I can't remember if it was like an untrained individual or how big the individuals were, etc. But like on average, if we just take that as a reference point. So yeah, I think there's that general misconception where people think, oh, well, okay, I'm in a deficit and I need to drive up expenditure, so let's add in more volume. Let's do drop sets, supersets. That's going to help expend more energy. In my opinion, and I know that you're of the same opinion on this, we've had many discussions in the past about that. It's just driving up fatigue. It's honestly just counterproductive. It's not going to bring any further benefit to the table in terms of driving up lipolysis, other than just ramping up systemic fatigue.
Yeah. So I'm going to give there is no pros of it. I was going to say I'm going to give the pros and cons. There is no pros. So when you're looking at expenditure in a prep scenario, you want to create the least stressful environment possible, because that's going to lead to the best look. The less loss of skeletal muscle tissue. You're just going to present a better package the less fatigue you go through. So then you're looking at it, we want to find ways of expending calories that are going to yield the least fatigue. The absolute, like the low hanging fruit, the best option there is NEAT. Obviously, there's a threshold where you can't do any more steps because it then just becomes mentally stressful because everyone has a job, everyone has commitments. You can't do 25,000 steps a day. Therefore, that's why we use cardiovascular activity as well. So your cardio and NEAT. Then when I see people doing drop sets or adding more sets to their training, the negatives of doing this, one, that is the most fatiguing way you can create a larger deficit. And it's such a minimal effect on the deficit that it's pointless. Secondly, training performance is key in retaining muscle tissue. You do more in a prep scenario, so your recovery capabilities are going to be dropping throughout prep. If you are then going to add in more volume as you move through, the issue then becomes that as your recovery is coming down, the amount of volume you're doing is coming up. What's going to happen? You're going to have a negative effect on recovery, meaning your recovery from session to session will be lowering, which means it's going to get to a point where your performance markers are going to go down because you can't efficiently recover between sessions. What is the key thing that's going to drive our ability to retain muscle tissue? Mechanical tension. You are not going to be able to keep the level of mechanical tension you did at the start of a prep to the end if you're constantly having increments to your training volume. You're going to get weaker, you're going to lose muscle, you're going to be filled with information. It's not going to be the best look you can present when I could just say do an extra 2,000 steps. And actually throughout prep, you want to be reducing your volume as you come down. Because as you are less able to recover from things, you want to keep mechanical tension as high as you can. Therefore, you need to take some sets and some volume away to allow you to recover efficiently between sessions to perform at your best.
I always say to my athletes, when we're looking at transitioning into that prep setting, we are looking at predominantly just protecting performance at all costs. So that would be a case of manipulating volume as needed. And going back to the analogy that you gave at the beginning with the bank, if you're taking those calories out, you're taking that money out, you don't have that money there, so to speak, to pay off that debt. So you're ramping up the volume, recovery is obviously coming down. Now you've got this big discrepancy, but you don't have the calories to pay off that debt. So it's just so counterintuitive in my opinion.
And this is another thing as well. So it's very good to look at pros and what they're doing and get ideas. What you do need to remember is the reason they're pros is because their genetics are probably better than yours. Therefore, they can get away with doing untold amount of volume at the back end of preps. Doesn't mean, if I did the same amount of volume as, let's say, Rob Taylor, he's someone who trains predominantly high volume, I would lose all my muscle. But you can see he can do a 3-hour leg session, and by the end of it, he still looks full as a house. And you just need to realize there is a difference, inter-individual differences in genetic capabilities towards these things. So don't just copy what someone else is doing because you've seen it and they look great, because that it potentially won't work for you. It may do, it may not, but you need to do everything for the individual. That's why everyone I prep this year is going to inevitably do it in a different way. Same with yourself. No two preps are the same, right?
For sure. I think it's also to add into there a little caveat, and obviously this isn't directed at Rob Taylor, but just generally speaking, you have to realize that some people are going to be assisted in what they're taking as well. Some people hyper responders, like that is a thing. We can save that for a different episode. Some people are hypo responsive, some people are hyper responsive to the compounds that we're using. So, you have to bear that in mind also. The people who are assisted, what are they taking? How much are they taking? And those who are not assisted. It's a thing to factor in. I think we spent enough on that one. Anything else? Touch on?
No, I think that covers everything there. And obviously, I think in the next few episodes, we will focus more on the nutrition side of a deficit. And
I just meant more so on physical activity, because we've we'll cover also TF. But I agree as well. At a later date, kind of to coincide with this episode, we'll talk about the nutritional side of things. But like this kind of touches on that briefly. We're looking at TEF, which is the thermic effect of food. So essentially, the different macronutrients, protein, carbs, and fats will all have a different thermic effect in terms of metabolism and digestion. Protein being the highest percentage. I think on average, they're looking around like 20-30% thermic effect. Carbohydrates is somewhere between like 5 and 10%, and fats at the bottom, it's like 0 to 3%. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's negligible when you're looking at fat. So the takeaway with that information there is obviously we're going to be looking at having protein as high as possible, obviously relative to the requirements and needs of the individual. Generally speaking, we're looking at like what 1 pound per 1 gram per pound of body weight, which is what
Yep.
2.2 kilos per pound of body weight on average. I know sometimes people can argue that we can go a little bit lower than that. Again, I think if you're looking at an assisted individual, they could probably get away with a little bit less, and that can just kind of you can at the expense of more carbohydrates. Yeah, then you're looking at carbohydrates and fats as well. I don't know what your opinion is on all of that, or
My opinion is, I mean, the highest TEF is protein. Another positive of using higher amounts of protein is it's the most satiating macro, so it's the most filling. So in a prep scenario, the more protein you have, the more full you're going to feel compared to like per calorie. Protein is the most filling compared to carbohydrates and fats. So I don't see why you wouldn't use higher fats.
yeah,
If you're thinking, if the reason sorry, higher proteins. If the reason you're trying to lower your protein is to have more carbs, what I would simply do is have a slightly lower protein on your training day, so you can account for some more carbs, and then just swap it around on your non-training day.
yeah, yeah, I agree with that one. Um, I think that's pretty much it for thermic effect of food. And then should we finish off with cardio?
Yep.
So I think one of the question or suggestion that I got on my poll on Instagram, which I thought would be quite interesting to get our opinion on, is fasted versus fed state cardio in a deficit. What's your take?
It doesn't matter unless you're taking drugs. Like,
Exactly.
if
So
if you are
that's
taking if you're
yeah,
taking GH combine and things along those lines, fasted state, you're going to get more bang for your buck. If you're a natural athlete, just do it when is the most convenient and least stressful time for you to do cardio. Preferably not post workout though. I would rather it just for its on hypertrophy and your ability to perform. If you're going to do cardio on the same day as your training, if you're doing it before training, make sure there's a good few meals between that have carbohydrates in, so you can fuel your session. Or if you're doing it after training, which I would always prefer someone do it before in the morning if possible. If after training, just at least have your post workout meal, let that digest, and then do your cardio. Needs must if you want to do your cardio post workout, and for time reasons, not going to have a huge effect. But when we're looking at marginal gains, preferably outside of that window.
yeah, for sure. It just comes down to like that 1%. If you're looking for that 1% of optimization, that's when we would advise it. Do it away from your training sessions. But at the end of the day, when you're looking from a practicality standpoint, if that is the only time that you can get your cardio done, then just do it. Because people can misinterpret that as saying, oh, well, Henry's saying that you have to do your cardio only away from your workout, but I can't do that. So therefore I can't do my cardio.
Yeah, and that's not the case at all.
We're not
It's like
saying,
there's an ideal world and a realistic world.
yeah, yeah. We will always, as coaches, we're looking and we're striving for optimality, but then you also have to think practical as well.
And I think optimal is, in essence, for the individual. If I was to send an individual back to the gym 2 hours after their training window to then go and do cardio, but that's 11 p.m., is that then optimal? Because that's going to have an effect on their sleep, their ability to recover. So optimal is person dependent, not just what you've read in literature. It needs to be applied to the situation. Does this work for that individual with their current setup? If it's going to cause more stress to them, therefore that then doesn't become optimal, because it becomes literally a ball ache for that individual at that point.
Yeah, I remember it's not cardio, but it was like in relation to steps. There was a female client that I was working with a few years back, and she came to me from a previous coach. Obviously, I'm not going to out anybody and name any names, but she was basically saying exactly that, where her previous coach was saying you need to get X amount of steps in, but she was a mother of two, and after she put obviously the kids to bed, she fed them, showered, put them to bed. It was like 10 o'clock at night, and then she was going out to get her steps done. And this is like during winter time, so it's freezing cold, it's raining, it's pitch black. But her coach just said that's what you have to do. So then it has to be optimal to that person's lifestyle.
As a coach, your role is to be able to communicate. If you haven't picked up on these things from your clients, then that's a fault of the coach. You need to create an environment that is the least stressful and the most adherable for that individual. If you can't do that, I don't think you can be a good coach.
No, 100%. I think just saying what you think is going to be best for that individual based off of like what you've done and off of that premise, I feel like there's zero skill in that at all. Anybody can do it. Anybody can just say, right, be in a deficit, take these calories out, do this training session, do this many steps. This is your cardio, but it has to be, adaptable and applicable to that individual's lifestyle.
Yeah, great.
Just to touch on my opinion with the fasted and fed state, I completely agree. I think in conjunction with particular compounds that you're using, a fasted state would obviously provide more utility. So if you're using things like growth hormone, clenbuterol, your himbine, T4, T3, those lipolytics and that, in the setting of being in a fasted state, you're just going to get more. Obviously, if you're using those in conjunction, those compounds, you're going to get more of a synergistic effect. But then also in the fact that your serum insulin levels, amino acids, dietary fats are all going to be like non-existent. Well, non-existent. They're going to be very low, and that's going to help further drive up lipolysis. But then other than that, I think if you're not assisted or you're not using those particular compounds, it doesn't really matter whenever it suits you.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah. That's pretty much it. Anything to add on?
No. I think we've covered that. Obviously, if people have feedback, reach out to one of us, and we can touch up on anything you might have questions on.
Yeah, for sure. Right, so we'll wrap it up there. Again, thank you as always for tuning in and listening to the podcast. As always, support us by just putting us out there, do your thing, and we'll see you all guys on episode 3. Cheers.
See you next week.
Yep. Right. I don't know.